Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hi, I'm Julie Gunlock, Director of the Culture of Alarmism Project at the Independent Women's Forum, and your host for today's Working for Women podcast. Today, I'm here with Hank Campbell. Hank is the president of the American Council on Science and Health. The council was founded in 1978 by one of my idols, Dr. Elizabeth Whelan, to support and further evidence-based science and medicine. So basically, Hank's organization was fighting fake news before it was cool and hip to fight fake news. Prior to joining the council, Hank was the founder of the Science 2.0 movement, which has been an amazing force in democratizing and demystifying science for millions of Americans. Hank has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Wired, and many more. Hank, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the program and for the introduction. It's always nice to hear a shout-out to Beth Whelan. I think she inspired a lot of us.
She really does, particularly, it's a real movement, women in science now, and trying to debunk a lot of the myths out there. And she was doing this, for much longer and before many of us were getting into the field. So she was a real leader in that field, and I do always try to recognize her. So again, it's thrilling for me to have you on and to have someone from your organization on. I'm a big admirer of what you do. So let me just we're going to talk today about Rachel Carson. I know this is a subject that both you and I have written about and are interested in. For those listening in, this might not be a name that you're familiar with, but certainly for those who follow the environmental movement or are involved in the environmental movement, this is someone you definitely recognize. Rachel Carson is the author of the 1962 landmark environmental book called Silent Spring. And again, I just want to give just a little bit of information on her. Rachel Carson was a biologist. In 1962, she wrote the book Silent Spring, which argued that man-made chemicals, like pesticides and other chemicals used in manufacturing, were threatening human health and the environment. Carson suggested that man-made chemicals affect the processes of the human body in, quote, sinister and often deadly ways. Now, in 2002, a couple years ago, there were a number of glowing articles about Rachel Carson because environmentalists were celebrating the 50-year anniversary of her book. But that has died down again. You still see references to her, but a couple years ago, Rachel Carson was in the news again, and recently I've seen her name pop up again, so I thought it was time to talk about Rachel Carson and to talk about her book. And the reason I've seen her name pop up is PBS is running a documentary on Rachel Carson, a glowing documentary on Rachel Carson. So again, I think her name is in the news. I think people are seeing reference to her. So I thought that it was important that we, again, get the truth out about Rachel Carson and her book. So, Hank, maybe you can give us, I've given kind of a quick sort of elevator speech about Rachel Carson, but maybe you can give listeners a little bit more information about her and her book.
Sure. I mean, Rachel, as you said, she was a biologist who was very concerned about environmental issues. She had worked for Fish and Wildlife, and then she had already written a best-selling book. So later in the 1950s, after she had expressed some concern about pesticides and things like that, the Audubon Society had said, you should write a book. And she went to a publisher, and they had originally she had a co-author because they wanted to kind of make sure that this stayed as an evidence-based thing. Edwin Diamond, who was a Newsweek senior editor, and things fell apart between them pretty quickly. And after the book came out, he was one of the early critics, along with every scientist, because it really it's regarded as a scientific work now because culture has skewed a little bit in environmental academia has skewed a little bit left. But at the time, it was dismissed by everybody who had any expertise.
Right. What did it do? What did her book do to the environmental movement? What did it mean to them, and how did it sort of? I mean, I would say it launched 1,000 movements within the environmental movement. I mean, I think after that book came out, you had a real focus on things like DDT and other pesticides and other and other chemicals. How did it sort of encourage the environmental movement in this area?
in the modern environmental movement, it really created it, because prior to that, there had been more of a biology movement. You wanted to control disease at the biological level, so that's where it level. So you had things like eugenics and those efforts, and it was only later that it became about population control and worries about food and I mean, it was such a contrast, because coming out of the 1950s, we were really entering into a golden age of science fiction. We had unlocked DNA. We had discovered coenzyme Q, and we could solve aging. We had, polio was eliminated, and all these other diseases were going to be gone too. So we were entering the 1960s in this really, really great period where all of these things were going to be solved, and science was going to do it. And then you had this thunderclap where suddenly you have 1 million copies of a book being sold that said, no, science is actually killing the environment, and man is not mature enough to understand all the residual impacts and things like that. And it got 2 science panels called. At that point, it isn't that she was suddenly advancing science. The environmental movement wanted to be impact players. So they've tried to duplicate that since then, where everybody wants to have that kind of impact where you'll be talked about 50 years later, regardless of the science. You want to be known for the amount of effect that you had on culture. And I think that's a real weakness in the environmental movement in modern times, because Rachel Carson would obviously be a fan of GMOs. Somebody who was against chemicals would be a big fan of a biological solution, and the modern environmental movement is just against everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. She would also probably be for nuclear power because it is a clean power source. I mean, it's very interesting that you say that there is this real disconnect now. Environmental movements just sort of sweep up everything that they see as as a danger. Where when you look at the sort of point of environmentalism to improve the environment, there are many technologies out there that can do just that they're against, just because I guess in their view it's progress, or it's a technological advance that they don't approve of. You mentioned, though, a lot about, we have been talking about the environment, but she talked a lot about this dystopian picture, right, of you mentioned like the early 1960s, that we were really going into this really exciting time of progress and environmental and technological advance. But she paints this really kind of frightening future where the environment is so poisoned by chemicals that no birds sing, right? That was the point of Silent Spring, that we're going to kill all the birds. She also said that 1 in 4 people would die from cancers caused by exposure to these chemicals. Hank, can you tell, I feel like at IWF, and I feel certainly with your organization, that we often tell good news stories, like, hey, don't be so freaked out. There's some good news out there, right? Tell us a little bit about cancer rates in this country.
Cancer rates, except for, obviously we're, as a health organization, we're against smoking. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're smoking, just stop. But outside those sort of lifestyle, let's call them lifestyle diseases, behavioral stuff, smoking and excessive drinking and things like that, cancer rates have absolutely plummeted, despite the fact that we really have more chemicals than ever. So
chemical use has increased, right?
And this is the odd disconnect with sort of the exaggerated claims of today. Is people in the environmental movement today know less about toxicology than Paracelsus knew in 1600. The dose makes the poison. These trace amounts of chemicals that can be found were biologically engineered to express all of that stuff out without any issue at all, no matter if you do it for 10,000 days in a row, it makes no difference. But people don't seem to get that. They think if you can detect any sort of pathogen, that it's going to lead to a pathology. And that's just incorrect. And it's because of this legacy of Rachel Carson, and some of her claims are fabricated. There's no reference for her claim that 90 species of birds were dying off due to this stuff. I mean, if you read through the bibliography, it's a lot of the same sources, and none of it's evidence-based.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the human cost. I want to stay on this trajectory that we're on, talking about the environmental movement, but also the human cost of Carson's propaganda, which I call it propaganda at this point. As you've mentioned, her book has been debunked. I mean, there is one scientist who does a line-by-line refutation of her book, which is a fascinating read. But, let's talk a little bit about the human cost, how Carson's book fed this fight to ban chemicals that can help fight mosquito-transmitted disease, such as malaria and Zika and West Nile virus. What has been the human toll? What what's the estimates on people who, talk a little bit about the bans on DDT, how DDT was effective in America in spraying in the 1950s, and how that stopped, and what the result of that has been.
It was really effective. This was invented in 1943, and in 1944, when the Nazis were leaving Italy, they destroyed the infrastructure. So you had a lot of lice. You had no sanitation, things like that. And this had been tested. It was the first time that the British rolled it out, and they went in and they sprayed Italians with this, and typhus basically disappeared in a few days. It was this miracle of modern chemistry. And in the 50s, it was shown to be effective in lots of places. They used it in Japan, any place where you had a lot of pests. And so, of course, malaria is this holocaust that happens in these developing nations, and we have banned it. But the odd thing is, our EPA bans it in the United States, but our EPA also writes the guidelines for how you can spray it in other countries inside homes. So our EPA has one law that's on the books for us, but they completely have to recognize that in other countries, DDT is not only safe, but they're spraying it inside people's homes.
Right. It's interesting when you think that the chemist, Paul Hermann Mueller, who sort of discovered the insecticide qualities of DDT, he won a Nobel Peace Prize, I think, Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for his discovery of DDT as effective against these vectors. So it's interesting to think of how DDT is thought of today, and then when it was discovered, because it was so effective, it was thought of as this sort of miracle substance that could, as you say, do away with typhus and malaria and really scary items or vectors.
And now some of this, look, it was overused in some spots, right?
Sure.
Farmers today are very, very evidence-based. They're very scientific. The big data that they use is terrific. But at the time, they figured if X amount was good, the next time 2 would be better. That luckily we've gotten away from. But that would have happened without demonizing a particular chemical or having 500 million kids die from malaria and things like that. I mean,
are they using DDT? Has it resurfaced? I mean, what is the situation now with DDT? I know that there was sort of this. It was banned. I don't remember what year. Was it 1982 or 72. Maybe it was before that in the United States? But what's the current situation with DDT? Is it used in some of these countries, developing nations that still have problems with malaria and other diseases?
It is. The World Health Organization recommends it. They, there was a period of time where it was unsure, and obviously the EPA was actually created to prevent that sort of thing from happening again. This ban on people think that the EPA was created to find these problems, but in reality this was a political solution to a scientific concern, and it was basically a bunch of people in Congress who wanted this thing gone. So EPA scientists had actually cleared DDT, and then the acting head of the EPA, who had been appointed, went ahead and banned it anyway. But that was over the science objection. So it's still used in these other countries because the World Health Organization recognizes their nets and things like that don't work all that well. There is no cost-effective solution that will still kill and these bugs and eliminate that kind of vector-borne disease. So they still use it. We write the guidelines to help them spray it in their homes, but it's never going to be allowed in the United States again.
But there was a period of time, am I wrong? There was a period of time where DDT totally was not used by many other countries. I mean, it's sort of it went. There was a period of time where many countries in Africa and in South America and in Asia were not using DDT. It has started to be used again. Is that correct?
It is. America leads the world in science and technology, and we have for decades, really. So when the EPA said this was something that was banned, it was just a matter, of course, that other countries would say there must be a good reason they banned it. But eventually, the international community said, this doesn't make any sense. The data doesn't show that there is any harm. And malaria really spiked upward in those areas, so then they began to use it again.
Right, and there have been some estimates. I mean, some are hundreds of thousands, some say millions died because of that period of fear-mongering about DDT, the overreaction to ban DDT. And again, I think it's important to point out that in the 1950s, we had these programs to spray. My mom and dad have talked about running behind the truck and sort of playing in the gas, in the cloud that was formed. My dad always chuckles about all the fear-mongering about DDT because he says he must have drank gallons of it running behind those trucks. There actually has been there is some evidence that humans can ingest quite large quantities of it and not be harmed by it. But it's interesting that those bans took place after malaria had essentially been eradicated in the United States. Again, it's one of these things where a very, to use a current phrase, a very privileged group of people ban a substance that saved them, and preventing these other people from using it. So it's really quite tragic.
And we see the corollary now in the anti-vaccine movement, where once polio and things like this are wiped out, you kind of forget what the dreadful impacts were. So it's easy to have that sense of entitlement and go, well, maybe vaccines had nothing to do with saving all these lives, and they're not necessary. And it's a little bit of scaremongering, but it's a second-order problem. These are people who have benefited from this scientific advance and now get to take it for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. We see it's so true. We see that in the anti-vaccine movement. We see that again in a lot of agriculture practices. The GMO movement, or the anti-GMO movement, I should say. People have, they can just go to their Giant or their Safeway or their Costco and get whatever produce they need. They don't actually have to live on, they don't have to grow their own food. And so it's very easy to be against these technologies when you really don't know what it's like to live without them.
I hunt, and I've had people criticize me and say, you shouldn't do that. It's cruel. You should just go to the grocery store and get meat like you're supposed to. And how do you respond to that? They don't understand how food works.
I know. Well, look, we should do another show entirely on food labeling. I'm a mom, and I do all the shopping, and I hang out at school, and I'm around other mothers, and some of the things that I hear stand around other moms about how they're so morally superior because they never feed their child processed food. Meanwhile, she's taking out a bag of organic crackers that, I guess because it has organic on it, she thinks it's not processed. I mean, even the tomatoes and lettuce and cabbage in your produce section has been, yes, it's fresh food, but it's been processed in some way. It's been, the leaves and the bugs have been removed, and it's been rinsed off, and sometimes it's been wrapped in plastic. I mean, processing is not necessarily bad, but we are getting way off our subject here, but you're right. There's a lot of misunderstandings of the food, of agriculture, of food, of medicine, and a lot of it is fueled by really bad information like Rachel Carson, which continues in our culture today to be seen as a valid source of information. This PBS documentary that is coming out is nothing but a glowing review of Rachel Carson and her book. I'm Deborah Bloom, who is a science reporter. She's on the science beat for a major newspaper. Is in the documentary, and she's been tweeting glowing reviews about the documentary. It really does astonish me today that Rachel Carson is still regarded as this great science leader in our country. You said at the time of her book, it was sort of dismissed by the scientific community and then taken up by the environmental movement. That makes sense to me, but it really is frustrating to me to see her still receiving such praise when, one read of the book and that most of it's exaggeration and some of it's fabrication.
She never had to defend her thesis. She died in 1964. Right. So, when someone, it's like being a rock star and you die early. You never have to be held accountable for anything that you do from that point on. So it's a snapshot in time. I just wish that the public would recognize that it's no longer the 1950s, and we have lots and lots of different chemicals that are incredibly safe, and they're responsibly used. Farmers are terrific for not just cost reasons, but in sparing land and using water efficiently, using energy efficient. Agriculture is fantastic compared to what it was in the 1950s.
Right,
and I think people need to recognize that and sort of stop the war on our food. Our food is safe, and it's a boring message to try and get out there to people. It's certainly not as sexy as scaring people about every chemical and every food product of the week, but it's an important message nonetheless.
It absolutely is. Look, I think this has been a great conversation, Hank. I'm thrilled that you came on to talk about this. I hope this helps inform people a little bit more when maybe they see mention of this on Twitter, or if they see the show on PBS. Look, I think people need to use some critical thinking, particularly when it comes to these really important issues, like chemicals that can be used to save lives and make food more available and less expensive. So thank you so much for Hank for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the program, Julie.
This has been another edition of the Working for Women podcast. You can check other podcast subjects at iwf.org. Thanks again for tuning in.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by iwf.org for similar content.